Welcome to Saturday Morning Classics. This week we are reading the final chapter of the Manitou by Graham Masterton. It's been an interesting read, so sit back, grab a cup of coffee, and enjoy the rest of the story. Chapter 10, Into the Light. I followed Singing Rock out of the first aid room and into the corridor. His black eyes were glittering again with some of the zeal that I had slowly seen extinguished by our long and harrowing night. He said, "This is it, Harry. Are you coming to help me?" "This is what? What the hell's going to happen?" Singing Rock licked his lips. His voice was breathless, and he looked as if he were feverishly ill. "The Great Old One is here. To wrestle with the Great Old One himself. Don't you understand what that means to a medicine man? It's like a Christian having the chance to fight with Satan in person." "Singing Rock, we have to do it," said Singing Rock. "We have no time left at all. We have to go down there and do it." "Go down there? You mean back to the 10th floor? Singing Rock appeared to grow in size, as if some magical wind was inflating him. He was trembling with fear and anticipation, and the ultimate lust of risking his life against the greatest evil being of mythical America. When I said nothing more, he simply turned away and began to walk quickly toward the stairs, so fast I could hardly keep up with him. I snatched his sleeve, and he turned around. "Singing Rock," I said, 11 armed men were killed down there. You saw what happened." "It's too late," said Singing Rock. "The Great Old One is here, and what happens now will be worse." "Singing Rock!" He pulled himself away. He opened the door that led to the darkened stairway and said, "Are you coming, or are you staying behind?" Echoing up the stairwell, I heard the loathsome moaning of that windless wind, and the hairs prickled on the back of my neck. The fetid stench of the Great Old One filled the air, and I could hear noises from down below that reminded me of Doré's engravings of hell. Demons and beasts and nameless things that walked by night, things that drove men mad, things that hopped and crawled and dragged themselves across the darkness of terrified imagination. I swallowed hard. No matter how frightened I felt, I couldn't let Singing Rock go down there on his own. I said, "I'm coming," and pushed past him onto the concrete landing. If I didn't go now, I never would. Once the door swung closed behind us, we were plunged into suffocating gloom. We held on to the handrail and groped our way downward, stair by stair. Each shadow filled me with creeping fear, and every shuffle and echo made my heart tense up. I could have sworn I heard footsteps descending the stairs just out of sight below us, but there was no time to stop and listen. "Singing Rock," I whispered, "what are we going to do?" "I'm trying to think," said Singing Rock quietly, "but I can't judge the situation until I see it for myself. I just hope that I can invoke Unitrak's spirit at the right time and in the right way. I just hope, too, that Unitrak isn't as hostile to us as it is to the Great Old One. There's always that risk." I coughed. "Supposing we simply surrender, wouldn't that save more lives? If we fight like this, God knows how many people are going to get hurt." Singing Rock shook his head. "This is not a fight in the sense you think it is. This is an act of revenge by a red Indian sorcerer in the name of all the pain and treachery and slaughter that his people suffered at the hands of the white man. You cannot surrender to someone who is seeking vengeance. Miss Comakis will only be satisfied when we are all dead. And as for the Great Old One—" "What about the Great Old One?" Singing Rock shrugged. "I don't know what bargain Miss Comakis has made with him, but the Great Old One is known in Pueblo culture as the Great Devourer. The Paiute had another name, He Who Feeds in the Pit. You can draw your own conclusions." As we descended through the darkness, the mournful whining and moaning of the wind that wasn't wind became even louder and even more depressing. I began to develop a pounding migraine, and I could hardly see straight. I felt itchy and uncomfortable, and I had the feeling that my clothes were riddled with lice. If I'd had any choice, I would have given up then and let the great old one, he who feeds in the pit, do his worst. Singing Rock said, "We're getting nearer. That's why you feel so bad. Here, take this bead necklace. It isn't much, but it should help to protect you against tricks and illusions." Almost deafened by the shrieking wind, we reached the 10th floor. Singing Rock produced the piece of paper on which he had written the numbers from Unitrack and peered at them closely through the gloom. Then he gave me the thumbs up and gently pushed open the door that led into the corridors where Miss Quamacus lurked, and where now the great old one, the terrible, malevolent Manitou of centuries past, was hideously coming to life. The stench was sickening. Even though the corridors were empty, there was a scuttling, rat-like noise everywhere, a noise that even the moaning of the wind could not drown. It was as if the whole place was alive with invisible rodents swarming and clustering around the decaying smell of the great old one. Singing Rock turned around to reassure himself that I was still behind him, and then led the way toward Karen Tandy's room, the room where Miss Quamacus had first made his obscene appearance. The drone of the star beast's astral wind made me feel exhausted and irritable. As we came near to Karen Tandy's room, the noise grew louder and louder until it sawed through all my senses with the coarse pain of a rusty blade. All around us, as we walked, there was the scuttling of ghostly rat creatures, as if we had a loathsome escort of parasites wherever we went. Once I felt as if one of them had jumped on my back, and I found myself tugging at my shirt in disgust and fear. Singing Rock had begun his incantations. He was calling on the spirits of the Sioux Nation to protect us from the devouring evil of the great old one, on the Manitous of the air, the rocks, and the soil, on the demons of sickness and plague to strike Miss Quamacus down. I could hardly hear what he was saying above the shrieking of that unearthly wind, but I could feel that our rat escort was treating us with a certain amount of impatient respect. We turned a corner, and suddenly the corridor was laced with brilliant flashes of light, which crackled and spat all around us. Singing Rock raised his hands, palm outward, and the light poured against them and spent itself on the concrete floor. It was the lightning that sees, the first indication that Miss Quamacus knew we were there. We reached the stretch of corridor in which Karen Tandy's room actually was. The lightning that sees seemed to have dispersed most of the phantom rat creatures, but the groaning wind continued, and now it was a real wind that blew against our faces like grit. Singing Rock beckoned me onwards, and we fought our way nearer and nearer to our inevitable confrontation with Miss Quamacus and the great old one. The shrieking and howling of the wind made it impossible for us to speak, and out of the door of Karen's room we saw sizzling flashes of astral light, the cold blue energy that had created the gateway for the greatest and most terrible of all legendary beings. Then, against a tearing hurricane, we reached the door itself. Singing Rock looked in first and abruptly turned his head away in sheer terror, jerking his hand over his face like a man in the spasms of electrocution. I looked too, and I was stunned into such dread and fear that I felt as if I could never move from that doorway again. The room was thick with evil-smelling smoke, pouring ceaselessly from two fires which Miss Quamacus had lit in metal bowls and placed on either side of his astral gateway. On the floor was marked out the most sinister and bizarre circle of figures that I had ever seen, all elaborately drawn and colored in what must have been the gore of Lieutenant Marino's police officers. There were strange goats and hideous creatures like enormous slugs, and naked women with loathsome beasts emerging from their wombs. Presiding over this circle, hunched and deformed, his dark body blurry through the smoke, was Misquamacus. But it was not Misquamacus himself that struck the greatest terror in us. It was what we could dimly perceive through the densest clouds of smoke, a boiling turmoil of sinister shadow that seemed to grow and grow through the gloom like a squid or some raw and massive confusion of snakes and beasts and monsters. What was so terrifying was that I recognized the great old one. I recognized how close he had always been to me. He was the fright of strange shapes in wallpaper and drapes, the terror of faces that appear in the grain of wooden wardrobes, the fear of darkened stairs or curious and half-seen reflections in mirrors and windows. Here, in the writhing shape of the great old one, I discovered where all my long-buried fears and anxieties had come from. Every time you hear disembodied breathing in your bedroom at night, every time the clothes you have carelessly left on your chair seem to take the form of a sinister and monkish figure, every time you think you hear footsteps behind you as you climb the stairs, it is the evil presence of the great old one, straining malevolently at the locks and seals which keep him on the other side. Misquamacus raised his arms and howled a chilling howl of triumph. His eyes seemed to be lighted from within, goat-like and satanic, and his body on its stunted legs was glistening with sweat. He had gloves of blood where he had torn bloodied bones out of Lieutenant Marino's men and used them to draw on the floor. Behind him, almost invisible in the smoke, the hideously frightening shape of the great old one twisted and squirmed. "It's now, Harry!" screamed Singing Rock. "Help me now! It's now! Now!" He buried his face in his hands and began to recite numbers and words, endless invocations to his own Manitous and spirits and the great spirit of white technology. I clung on to him, holding him tight, concentrating my terrified mind on Unitrack, Unitrack, Unitrack. The shrieking wind made it impossible for me to hear what Singing Rock was saying, but I pressed my mind into supporting him, into loving him, into keeping him safe, while he tried to overwhelm Misquamacus and the murky presence of he who feeds in the pit. There was a moment when I thought Singing Rock would make it. He was talking breathlessly fast, reciting and chanting and nodding, faster and faster, as if building up to the great summoning of Unitrack's technological Manitou. All this time, though, Misquamacus was chanting too, and sweeping his arms in our direction, as if to encourage the great old one to consume us. I saw things move through the smoke that were frightening beyond belief, shapes more ghastly and dreadful than the worst nightmares I had ever had, and octopus-like coils of mist that began to unfold from the gloomy cloud of the great old one. I knew we only had seconds in which to survive. I was tensed up so tightly that my muscles were locked, and I had bitten into my own tongue. Abruptly, Singing Rock slumped. He sagged and then fell to his knees. I knelt down beside him, brushing my hurricane-blown hair from my eyes, and yelled at him to carry on. He looked up at me, and there was nothing but fear on his face. "I can't," he shouted. "I can't summon Unitrack. I can't do it. It's a white man's Manitou. It won't come. It won't obey me." I couldn't believe it. I looked over my shoulder and saw Misquamacus pointing towards us with both hands, and the dark snakes of the great old one unrolling over his head, and I knew that this was the end of it. I snatched the crumpled fragment of paper from Singing Rock's hand and held it up to the flickering astral light of the weird and horrifying gateway. "Unitrack, save me!" I shouted. "Unitrack, save me!" And I screamed out the numbers again and again and again. "Unitrack! For God's sake, Unitrack!" Singing Rock, still clutched in my arms, moaned in fear. Misquamacus, his face stretched in a wolfish grin, was actually floating in the air above me, his arms outstretched and his deformed legs curled up underneath him. All around, the shifting and terrifying shapes of the great old one grew and grew. I was silent with fright for a moment. Then, because it was all I could think of to do, I raised my own arms, just like Misquamacus had raised his, and cast my own idea of a spell. "Unitrack, send your Manitou to destroy this wonder worker. Unitrack, protect me from harm. Unitrack, seal off the gateway to the great beyond and dismiss this hideous spirit." Misquamacus, floating eerily close, began to invoke the great old one in retaliation. His words sounded heavy and foggy, blurring through the howl of the hurricane like a vengeful beast. "Unitrack!" I bellowed. "Come to me, Unitrack, come!" It was then that Misquamacus was almost upon me, and his devilish eyes glared luridly from his dark, sweat-glossed face. His mouth was drawn back in a snarl of pain and effort and revenge. He drew circles and invisible diagrams in the air around me, bringing down the evil tumult of the great old one, arranging through his sorcery the most hideous of deaths that he could devise. "Unitrack," I whispered, unheard above the shriek of the gale. "Unitrack, come!" It was so violent and sudden when it happened that I couldn't understand it at first. I thought that Misquamacus had struck me down with the lightning that sees, or that the whole building had ripped apart around us. There was an ear-splitting sound that overwhelmed even the moan of the hurricane, an electrical crackling of millions upon millions of supercharged volts, a roar like 1,000 short circuits. The room was blotted out by a dazzling array of incandescent grid shapes, tier after tier of brilliant circuitry, crawling with white and blue sparks and shimmering with its own blinding symmetry. Misquamacus fell from the air, charred and blackened and bloody. He dropped to the floor like a carcass of beef, his hands clutched up underneath him, his eyes tight shut. The grids, pulsing and glowing, formed a fence between me and the murky shape of the great old one. I could see the demonic being shrink and twist, as if confused and frustrated. The voltage from the grid was so enormous that I could only look at it with my eyes half shut, and I could hardly see through it to the twitching, shadowy form of the great old one. There was no question in my mind what this blinding apparition was. It was the Manitou, the spirit, the internal essence of the Unitrack computer. My spell, my white man's invocation, had brought the blinding retaliation of a white man's demon. The great old one boiled and rolled in powerful coils of darkness. It let out a tortured groan that became an enraged bellow, louder and louder, until I felt I was being swallowed by its deafening, vibrant depths. A tunnel of screaming fury that made the walls shake and the floor tremble. The glowing grid of Unitrack's Manitou dimmed and flickered for a moment, but then it burned brighter still, a searing blast of technological power that blotted out all vision and all sound. I felt as if I had been plunged into a cauldron of molten steel, drowned in light and swamped in noise. I heard one thing more. It was a sound that I can never forget. It was like someone or something shrieking in intense agony, on and on, for longer than I could bear it. It was the sound of nerves being stripped bare, sensitivities being split apart, spirits being carved naked. It was the great old one. Its grip on the material world was being scorched away by Unitrak's limitless and sophisticated power. It was being driven back by the holy fire of today's technology to the dim and dismal haunts of an ancient astral plane. There was a rippling, bubbling, babbling noise, and the sides of the gateway that Miss Climacus had marked on the floor began to draw in toward their center, sucking the shadowy shape of the great old one like a ventilation pipe sucking in smoke. There was one final extravagant burst of power that left me dazzled and temporarily blinded, and then the room was silent. I lay there, unable to move, unable to see, for 5 or 10 minutes. When I was able to struggle up to my feet, there were still green grid shapes floating on my retina, and I had to shuffle around like an old man, bumping into walls and furniture. At last, my vision cleared. Not far away, Singing Rock lay on the floor amidst the debris of beds and broken furniture, his eyes flickering open as he gradually returned to consciousness. The body of Miss Climacus lay where it had fallen, hunched and burnt. The walls of the room looked as if they had been seared by flame, and the plastic Venetian blinds were melted into long, drooping strings. It wasn't any of these things that transfixed me, however. It was the pale, slender figure who stood silently in the corner of the room, wan and white, like a ghost of someone I once knew. I said nothing at all, but simply held my hands out to her, making her welcome back to an existence that she nearly lost forever. "Harry," she whispered, "I'm alive! Harry, I'm alive!" And it was then that Lieutenant Marino, his gun drawn, came bursting through the door to find us. I sat with Singing Rock at LaGuardia, under the massive bronze bust of LaGuardia himself, having a last cigarette before he caught his flight. He looked as neat and tidy as ever, with his shiny suit and his horn-rimmed glasses, and there was nothing to show what he had done or what he had been through, except for a Band-Aid across his cheek. We heard jets taxi down the runways outside, and the murmur of voices, and the late afternoon sun glowed orange in a wintry sky. "I feel a little sad in some ways," he said. "Sad?" I asked him. "About what?" "About Miss Climacus. If only we'd had a chance to explain to him what had happened. If only we could have communicated with him." I took a long drag at my cigarette. "It's a little late for that now, and remember that he would have killed us just as surely and quickly as we needed to kill him." Singing Rock nodded. "Perhaps we shall meet him again, in better circumstances. Then maybe we could talk." I said, "Wait a minute. He's dead, isn't he? What do you mean, meet him again?" Singing Rock took his eyeglasses off his nose and wiped them with a clean white handkerchief. "The body died, but we can't be sure that the Manitou was destroyed. Maybe it was released onto a higher plane and is ready to join those who exist without any physical presence at all. Maybe it will come back to Earth and live again in someone else's body." I frowned. "You're not saying that this could happen again?" Singing Rock shrugged. "Who knows? There are many mysteries in the universe that we know nothing about at all. What we see during our physical life on Earth is simply a fragment. There are strange worlds within worlds, and stranger worlds within those worlds. It would pay us not to forget that." "And the great old one?" Singing Rock collected his bag and stood up. "The great old one," he said, "will always be among us. For as long as there are dark nights and inexplicable fears, the great old one will always be there." That was all he said. He took my hand and squeezed it, and then went off to catch his flight. It was nearly 3 weeks later before I was able to get out to New England. I drove all the way, and the fields and the houses were still blanketed with snow. The sky was the color of gum, and an orange sun hid wanly behind the trees. I arrived just before dusk and pulled my cougar up in front of that elegant white painted colonial house and climbed out. The front door opened, and there was Jeremy Tandy, as dry and spry as ever, coming out to greet me and take my bags. "We're so pleased you could make it, Mr. Erskine," he said, as warmly as he knew how. "You must have had a cold trip." I wiped my feet on the doormat. It wasn't so bad. I enjoy adverse conditions. Inside, Mrs. Tandy took my coat, and it was warm and fire-lit and cheerful. The long sitting room was crowded with homely antiques, big colonial easy chairs and sofas, brass lamps, and plenty of ornaments and pictures of rural scenes. "Would you care for some hot chowder?" asked Mrs. Tandy, and I could have kissed her. I sat down in front of the fire. Jeremy Tandy poured me a large whiskey while his wife busied herself in the kitchen. "How's Karen?" I asked him. "Is she still improving?" Jeremy Tandy nodded. "She can't walk yet, but she's putting on weight, and she's much more cheerful. You can go on up and see her later. She's been looking forward to this visit all week." I sipped whiskey. "So have I," I said, a little tiredly. "I haven't been sleeping too well since this thing was over." Jeremy Tandy lowered his head. "Well, no, none of us have." We made small talk for a while, and then Mrs. Tandy brought me the chowder. It was good and hot and thick, and I sat by the crackling fire and ate it gratefully. Later, I went upstairs to see Karen. She was peaky and pale, but her father was right. She was putting on weight, and she was going to recover. I sat on the end of her country quilted walnut bed, and we talked about her hobbies and her future and everything in the world except Miss Quamacus. "Dr. Hughes told me privately that you were very brave," she said after a while. "He says that what really happened was nothing like the newspaper stories at all. He said that nobody would have believed them if they'd told the truth." I took her hand. "The truth isn't very important. I can't really believe the truth myself." She gave me a small, friendly smile. "I just wanted to say thank you, anyway, because I do think I owe you my life." "Don't mention it. Maybe you can do the same for me one day." I stood up. "I have to go downstairs now. Your mother told me not to tire you out. I think you're going to need all the rest you can get." "Okay," she laughed. "I'm getting a little bored with all this mollycoddling, but I guess I'll have to put up with it. If you need anything, just tell me," I said. "Books, magazines, fruit, just say the word." I opened the door to leave, and Karen said, "Debut, mynheer." I froze. I felt as if a pair of cold hands had been laid on my back. I turned around and said, "What did you just say?" Karen was still smiling. She said, "Be good, my dear." That's what I said. "Be good, my dear." I closed the door of her room. Outside, on the landing, it was silent and dark. The old colonial house creaked under the weight of the winter's snow. "Oh, that's what I thought you said," I whispered to myself, and went downstairs. I want to thank everyone who stuck with this story here to the end. It was interesting to hear the description of the computer and that everyone basically chain smokes while they're in the hospital. Things have certainly changed since the 70s when this book was written. I hope you'll join us again next week as we begin a new Saturday Morning Classics story. And don't forget to visit our merchandise store at thehiddencorners.com. Have a great week, everyone.